Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited. Welcome to today's virtual briefing on the impact of emergency cash on gig workers. My name is Tiffany Ferguson. I'm the program director here at the Workers Lab. Again, thank you all for taking the time to join us and really for your interest in learning more about our emergency cash transfer experiment, the Worker Strength Fund. We never imagined we'd be sharing our learning about emergency cash for workers at a moment when the world would be talking about emergency cash for workers. The goal of today's briefing is to provide you with an overview of the Worker Strength Fund pilot, why we did it, how we did it, what we learned, and what it teaches us about supporting workers in today's pandemic, but most importantly, in tomorrow's economic recovery. This is not a how-to briefing. You will not walk away today with a list of foolproof do's and don'ts, but what we do want you and expect that you will walk away with is a really deep understanding of what we've learned and gathered about the things that we should aspire to do more of and perhaps do a little less of. To kick us off, you'll hear why we did this work from our new leader at the Workers Lab, Adrian Haro, and Tim Flocka, Executive Director at Commonwealth. Then you'll hear our colleague at Commonwealth, Kiarash Jahanian, who will talk about how we did this work. He'll really take us on the journey and a much deeper dive on what the takeaways were from this pilot. After we've set that background context and highlighted some of those findings, we'll have 4 more of our Design Sprint partners teed up. They will be sharing a little bit more about some of the leading questions that we've been grappling with this entire pilot. Questions like, how do you get cash to gig workers quickly and efficiently? Who should pay for emergency cash? And what the role of government and policymakers and even private sector folks should be and perhaps ought to be in making emergency cash available. Those folks will be Adam Roseman, Rachel Schneider, Molly Cohen, and David Wow. Really excited to celebrate that today we are releasing our report, and you will be hearing more about this in the coming weeks. Today, what we are asking you to do is, if you want to engage, there's lots of ways you can do it. If you're joining us in the actual Zoom webinar, you can submit questions or things you want to learn about in the coming weeks in the Q&A function. If you're joining us from the live stream, feel free to tweet us at the Workers Lab, again, with comments, questions, and things you really want us to talk more about in the coming weeks. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to Adrian to help set the stage.
Thanks, Tiff, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Haro, and I am the new leader of the Workers Lab. I appreciate everyone taking an hour to be with us, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy. We've gathered here today to talk about this one thing, this incredibly timely report on the impact of emergency cash on gig workers, whose relevance has taken on a unique level of importance, given what we're all living through. But there's a real story about how we got here and why. And so what I want to do today is tell you that story. But before I do that, I want to express some gratitude to everybody involved here. First and foremost, I want to thank the Workers Lab team, our founder, Dr. Carmen Rojas, our board of directors for all of their hard work and support of this project over the last 2 years. I also want to thank our terrific partners, many of whom you'll hear from today. Rachel, thank you so much, Rachel. Tim, Melissa, Kairosh, Jerome, everybody at Commonwealth, thank you. Adam and Oz at Steady, thank you so much. Ben Geierhan, Nick Abramovich at the Workers Benefit Fund, thank you. Dean David Weil from Brandeis University, thank you so much. Thanks for all of your expertise and your collaboration. I'm also grateful to our funders, Google.org, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Prudential Foundation. Thank you all. And last but not least, I want to express some gratitude and thank all of the gig workers who gave their time, their stories, and their perspectives to this important work. Their contributions were invaluable, and we thank you. So, why did we engage in an experiment like this in the first place, right? First and foremost, because of our purpose as an organization. The Workers Lab exists to give new ideas about increasing worker power a chance to succeed and flourish. So it begs the question about how we do that, right? How do we give new ideas about increasing worker power a chance to succeed and flourish? Well, we take highly bold and flexible dollars and use them to enable experimentation and learning across a pretty broad spectrum of worker power. Indeed, this is how we think about power at the Workers Lab. The question for us is really power in service of what? What are we trying to help build power in service of through the experiments that we fund? So we believe it's in service of safety and health for workers, in service of greater recourse at work in the form of rights, of security and life in the form of pay and benefits, in service of greater control and mobility in and outside of the workplace, and certainly in service of making it easier for workers to participate in our society and our democracy. The idea here is that workers need all of these things. One worker needs all of these things in order to be the drivers of economic, political, and social transformation in our society. And so all the experiments we fund are aimed at increasing worker power in service of one or all of these outcomes. And indeed, the findings being presented today do just that as it pertains to security in life. And so we started 2 years ago now with sort of three things as the backdrop. The first was the rise of gig work and how this was undermining a set of protections and benefits that traditional W-2 workers had access to. The second was a conversation about the need for our social safety net to be more mobile and portable, because we knew that people were working more than one job and moving in between different types of work. And three, a report released by the Federal Reserve that showed that nearly 2/3 of workers didn't have $1,000 saved in case of an emergency. And this last point is really important, right? So 2/3 of workers didn't have $1,000 saved to cover an emergency expense. Lots of questions, right? What did a stat like that mean in an era of rising income inequality and wage stagnation? Does our social safety net in its current form actually consider the real-time, short-term financial needs workers are up against right now? You know, when you already feel like you've got the weight on your shoulders, what happens when life throws you a curveball in the form of an emergency or an unexpected expense? What tools or resources exist already for workers to turn to in desperate times? You know, my car's broke, but my car is my work. But if I pay to fix my car, then I can't pay my rent. It's an impossible situation, and it's really just too crazy. And in desperate times, we look for desperate measures, right? And you have to be really desperate to turn to a predatory payday loan at 300 or 400 or 500% interest. And so it was in this incredibly volatile moment that we chose to intervene, because it was clear that the existing set of solutions for workers to turn to in these moments was not only insufficient, in many cases, it was doing real harm. And we chose to focus this on gig workers in an effort to target a universe of workers with little to no safety net, no rights to minimum wage or things like medical benefits, sick leave or UI, AKA unemployment insurance, and workers we know are severely compromised in normal times, not to mention right now. So long before this pandemic, we were not only interested in the topic of emergency cash, but we were really curious about the impact it would have in the lives of workers alongside other safety net tools like savings and retirement. So we launched this experiment, right, to see what kind of difference a one-time, no strings attached cash grant in the amount of $1,000 would make in the increasingly precarious world that gig workers live in. And we set out with three key learning questions. How do we get workers the money they need with the least amount of friction? 2, who pays? And 3, what would they use this money for? What constitutes an emergency actually? Right? And so in order to answer these questions, we adapted Google's design sprint methodology, which is essentially a time-constrained 5-phase approach to solving problems and getting products to market quickly. We love the design sprint, and it is now formally a part of our program work at the lab. In addition to the speed and the discipline it engenders, the methodology also allows us to collaborate with all the folks you're going to hear from today, leaders from across sectors that allow us to pull on different levers of influence and expertise. And so together we surveyed and interviewed over 200 workers. We engaged several gig platform companies, large and small. And together we designed and piloted the Worker Strength Fund, which successfully delivered emergency cash grants in the amount of $1,000 to 350 gig workers, the learnings from which we are so proud to be able to share with you today. Perhaps most importantly, we learned that $1,000 just isn't enough. The average cost, as you'll hear a little bit later today, of an emergency was more like $3,000 in this experiment. And so we gained tremendous insight into just how destabilizing an emergency can be in the lives of these workers. That one unexpected expense can set off a spiral of financial misfortune. And while emergency cash, especially in moments like this, has a value and can help, it is not a silver bullet or a panacea. Emergency cash on its own is not and does not build worker power. It is just one tool in the power toolbox, pardon the pun, just one piece of a social safety net that is currently broken, insufficient, that needs to be revisited and reformed, and in partnership with workers, and aimed at helping them solve problems both in the short term and in the long term. So I'll stop there and thank everyone for being with us here again today. And I'm going to toss it over to two of our largest seed funders for this work. And I'll start with Emilia Carrera from the Rockefeller Foundation. Emilia.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, for the Rockefeller Foundation, this was an opportunity to partner with the Workers Lab, that is an extremely mission-driven organization and one of the leaders in the labor movement. Particularly the design sprint and our partnership presented an opportunity to source, nurture, and test innovative solutions that could improve the economic stability of working individuals in the US. This partnership, and I would say that the Worker Strength Fund, allowed us to ask better questions. And I think we've heard some of them, and we'll continue to hear some of them. What is an emergency? How do we effectively give cash to people? What is the right amount? But I think it also helped us answer some of those questions. And as Adrian mentioned, emergency cash is one of the tools. We know that people need increased wages and salaries. We know that they don't have, and I think the pilot confirmed that people don't have enough savings for emergencies or shocks. And at the Rockefeller Foundation, we're thinking about some of those other tools as well. How do we increase access to capital and credit for minority-owned businesses and consumers? So I would just want to congratulate the team for an excellent work and look forward to hearing more about the findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Emilia. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mahmud Ramadhan from google.org.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you all for joining. I also want to thank the wider Workers Lab team for their great partnership on this project and for hosting this briefing. As Adrian mentioned, my name is Mahmud Ramadhan. I'm a portfolio manager at google.org, and I was leading this project from the google.org side, working closely with the Workers Lab team. At google.org, we are big believers in direct cash assistance, and we have been piloting and experimenting with cash assistance in different contexts for nearly a decade now. And we've had many strong signals supporting the efficacy of these programs. So when the Workers Lab team came to us with this idea, it felt like the right thing to do, especially with the focus on gig workers, such a fast-growing segment of our economy, but also, as Adrian mentioned, because of the methodology they brought to the table, the methodology they wanted to adopt to reach these goals. The testing and learning approach, the design sprint methodology, these are all common practices here at Google. And having the Workers Lab adopt this approach allowed us to work even more closely with the team, holding joint workshops, pulling in from the Google product teams, some of our lead design sprint workshop leaders, bouncing ideas and refining the product together. So now we're excited to be looking at the results of this pilot. I'm sorry, I just realized that I didn't have my video on. Adrian, thank you for the nudge. So anyway, now we're excited to be looking at the results of this pilot, especially at a time where there's such a strong need for figuring out direct cash assistance. And we're excited to see how the Workers Lab team are building on their design sprint expertise to maybe dig deeper into this problem and perhaps explore other problems as well. So with that, really excited to be joining you all for that briefing, and I'll pass it back to Adrian.
Thanks so much, Mahmud and Amelia. We really appreciate everything you've done for us. Next, I'm going to toss it over to Tim Flacca from Commonwealth.
Thanks so much, Adrian. And again, thank you all for making time for this. I just want to say that this has been an honor for us to be a part of. And one of the things we realized early on, and a huge credit to the Workers Lab for really pulling together just an amazing and truly diverse group that have pulled this off. And it was an early on sign that we knew there was something exciting here. I wanted to take just a minute and introduce Commonwealth. I think some of you may not be familiar with us. For us, our purpose is financial security and opportunity for families and individuals who simply don't typically have access to that. And that's a phrase that's probably worth unpacking. What does financial security and opportunity mean? I mean, it means insulation from the day-to-day stresses of a financial life where you're worried about paying the bills and the sort of debilitating and really wasteful anxiety that causes. And it means the kind of safety and confidence and sense of control that comes from having some financial reserve, some cushion. And for us, ultimately, it means realistic pathways for families to build something of lasting value, to have the assets that are critical to long-term success and to mobility and to perhaps passing something on to your kids and feeling a sense of belonging in your community. And in our work, we start with the assumption, which really has come out from 20 years of work, that most people know what they need and they make the best choices they possibly can under the circumstances. We're not really in the business of trying to persuade people of what they want. We hope, in the business of trying to make it possible for them to get where they already want to go. And what we find is that too little attention is focused on the role of institutions and systems that often are failing to provide good tools and opportunities and choices for people. Said another way, institutions and systems sometimes just aren't designed to produce financial security and opportunity for everyone. So we attack that problem with innovation, new and useful ideas, and devise and test and try to see what works. And then when something works, hope to influence those large systems and institutions. And that's a perfect segue to this conversation, a truly interesting and, as we've seen, incredibly timely idea that we could play some role in testing. And the last thing I want to say is that for us, really from our start, issues of scale and sustainability have been critical. Really big problems demand, far-reaching and durable solutions. And in that light, we have always been committed to working with, understanding, and partnering with the private sector and the market, which we see as just an inescapable part of the puzzle when it comes to solving big problems. So the second thing I wanted to do before turning it over to my colleague Kiraj is to just talk for a moment about why this work matters at this moment. And I suspect many of us could provide the points I'm about to make. But if there's one thing we've seen in the last 2 months is what a financial emergency looks like. And we've seen it, we've seen it in tens of millions of people, and we've seen it in miles-long lines for food banks. So if there was ever a question of what that is, what that experience of having something come up largely out of the blue that has a dramatic effect on your family, your household, I think all of us in the country have a much clearer sense of that. But beyond that, what's really critical is that in this case, I don't think there's anybody who was walking around saying, well, that person did that to themselves, right? This is the prototypical shock that none of us could have foreseen or taken responsibility for, excuse me. And that's really important because so often it's tempting when confronted with something really awful to say, well, maybe if someone had made different choices, maybe they wouldn't be in this situation. And we're having a giant learning experiment in how that's just simply not the case. And the third thing that's really important about this moment is we have already seen an amazing legitimization, if that's a word, or normalization of responding with rapid infusions of money to people who are in moments of crisis. And I frankly don't think we would have foreseen this happening within the period of this pilot, that we would have seen something like the CARES Act with a massive massive response that in many ways mirrors something, what we have now tested. And then the final point is beyond just specific emergencies, I think we all see that financial vulnerability has been laid bare in a new way and is a much more pervasive issue that we need to wrestle with. So in a lot of ways, that's a really important moment for the work we've just done. And as Tiffany said at the top of the hour here, the timing is really significant. So let me turn it over to my colleague, Kirash, who has been living and breathing this work for the last 2 years and will walk us through many of the findings.
Great, thank you, Tim. My name is Kirash Chahanian. I'm a Senior Innovation Manager at Commonwealth, and I led the implementation and evaluation of the Workers' Strength Fund, or WSF pilot. Our goals in conducting this pilot were to better understand how low-income gig workers navigate unexpected expenses and how emergency grants could impact this financial challenge. We hypothesized that by quickly distributing emergency grants of up to $1,000 with limited conditions, the positive impact on workers' financial security would exceed the cost. We were also interested in understanding which workers would benefit most in what types of emergencies. To achieve these goals, we built a strong research plan informed by Commonwealth's extensive research and piloting experience to better understand for whom, when, and how emergency cash can be most impactful. We developed the WSF website to facilitate the fund request and distribution process. We generated users for the pilot by recruiting gig workers through steady and driver's benefits. We targeted steady users in Detroit, Dallas, and San Francisco, and we targeted both steady and driver's benefits users in New York City. We chose these 4 cities to ensure we had some measure of regional representation in the pilot. We ultimately funded 350 workers, all of whom had to share self-reported demographic data through the WSF website. We surveyed fund recipients to better understand the nature and extent of WSF's impact on their financial lives. We also surveyed steady and driver's benefits users who were invited but did not participate in the pilot to gauge the psychological impact of just knowing that WSF exists. And finally, we conducted interviews with a subset of recipients at 2 moments, after they received funds and 3 to 4 weeks after that to see if WSF's impact sustained. Now, there were a few ways in which WSF's impact was similar across recipients. Firstly, 61% of surveyed recipients were unable to work because of their cited emergency. 75% of these recipients said they returned to work as a direct result of WSF, and almost all of them returned to work within 2 weeks of receiving funds. Next, in our interviews, we asked recipients to rate their financial security at 3 different moments, right after their emergency occurred, immediately after receiving funds, and 3 to 4 weeks after that. Over 2/3 of recipients reported an immediate increase in financial security ratings after receiving funds, but this feeling mostly dissipated after 3 to 4 weeks. This highlights the immediacy of WSF's financial impact. And lastly, most recipients felt skeptical of WSF before receiving funds due to past experiences with fraudulent financial offers or scams. This skepticism quickly turned to joy and appreciation once they received funds. Recipients universally shared that WSF made them feel less stressed about their finances, and they felt they would be more confident in paying for an emergency if they were able to access WSF in the future. The relief, comfort, and general goodwill the fund inspired in recipients was central to WSF's impact. Now, from our extensive experience in developing solutions for financially vulnerable people, we believe that not all workers would experience WSF's impact similarly, and that this impact would be much more nuanced. This is why we set out to understand which workers would benefit most in which situations from receiving WSF funds. What we found was that this impact depended on the collection of circumstances that composed workers' financial lives, specifically what their financial journey was before they experienced their emergency, what their financial position was after their emergency occurred, and what material changes occurred in their financial lives as a result of receiving the $1,000 infusion. Investigating these factors and wrestling with the complexity of these workers' financial lives led us to the segmentation of recipients into 4 distinct groups, which you see here: struggling, staying afloat, newly aspirational, and trending upward. And I'll go into more detail on each of these groups in the following slides. So to start out, for the struggling group, every day was a challenge. Recipients in this group were always in a worse financial position than the other groups, and WSF only marginally improved their financial situation. This group was more likely to need money for multiple simultaneous financial emergencies and were not able to fully cover their emergencies with the $1,000 infusion. 3 to 4 weeks after receiving funds, they were back to struggling to make ends meet, and they were not confident that their financial circumstances would improve anytime soon. This group represented roughly 23% of recipients. Raquel, who you see on this slide, was one of our interviewees whose experience reflected many in the struggling group. She lived by herself in Detroit and worked as an administrative assistant at a local school, picking up gig and temp work when school was not in session. She needed funds for multiple emergencies, including rent and utilities and medical expenses. She was unique in that she was an extreme planner and budgeter. She did her best to stretch the $1,000 from WSF for as long as she possibly could, making 5 different fund requests over the span of 6 weeks. However, a quick succession of unmanageable expenses forced her to use up that $1,000 sooner than she would have liked to. Though she noted extreme psychological benefit from WSF, she still felt very financially insecure, especially since she did not have family or friends whom she could turn to for support. Now moving on to the Staying Afloat group, recipients in this group struggled financially, but were consistently getting by paycheck to paycheck before their emergency occurred. This group's initial emergency often had a cascading effect that led to additional financial hardship, causing them to struggle to pay for basic necessities and rent. WSF's financial impact was only temporary for this group, helping these recipients get back to living paycheck to paycheck, but not improving their ability to handle future emergencies. WSF's primary benefit for this group was preventing them from experiencing more dire financial circumstances after their emergency. This was the largest group of interviewees and roughly represents the majority of recipients. Wilson's experience is emblematic of this group's vulnerability to additional financial shocks. When we spoke with Wilson, he was a rideshare driver who recently moved from California to Arlington, Texas. He had underestimated the cost of his move and had fallen behind on rent. Before WSF, he was working 12-hour days to earn enough money to cover his rent. After receiving funds, Wilson said he felt very secure and still had some leftover funds to start building up his emergency savings. This peace of mind, however, did not last very long, as Wilson's car was totaled in an accident soon after our first interview. He shared in his second interview that he felt even less financially secure than when he initially turned to WSF, but that the fund lessened the damage to his overall financial well-being from the new emergency. Now moving on to the newly aspirational group. Recipients in this group tended to be in similar financial situations to those in either the struggling or staying afloat groups prior to WSF, but their specific circumstances allowed them to transcend that trajectory after receiving funds. These recipients tended to say that WSF completely resolved their emergency. They were able to build or rebuild their financial lives with WSF as a foundation, either because they could fully cover the cost of their emergency or because timely access to WSF helped them avoid the worst consequences of their emergency. 3 to 4 weeks after receiving funds, they were all in better financial positions than before and reported increased confidence and hope for the future. This group represented roughly 14% of recipients. So Helen's experience shows how WSF, combined with her specific financial circumstances, led her and her family to transcend their dire financial situation. Helen lives in Santa Cruz, California with her husband and 3 children. Before WSF, she felt extremely financially insecure as she and her husband did not have jobs, had run out of money, and were living out of their car. An opening at a homeless shelter was on the horizon for her and her family, but they would not be able to move in immediately. So Helen used WSF funds to cover several nights at a hotel for her and her family before moving into the homeless shelter. In the 4 weeks between our first and second interviews, Helen and her family had moved into the shelter and were about to complete a shelter-sponsored program that would have provide subsidized rent and free childcare. In addition, she had found a job and her husband had become certified as a personal trainer. Helen believed that her improved financial circumstances would not have been possible without WSF, though it's evident that other positive events in her life were also key to setting her on a path to increase financial security. Now moving on to the trending upward group. Compared to other groups, the trending upward group was in the best financial position prior to their emergency. WSF helped them pay their emergency expenses quicker than they otherwise would have been able to. Their perceptions of their financial situations consistently improved over time. They had concrete financial aspirations and reported better progress towards these aspirations a few weeks after receiving funds. This group represented roughly 17% of recipients. Isaac's example highlights how WSF helped this group quickly resolve their emergencies. Isaac lives in San Jose, California, and drives for rideshare apps as his primary source of income. He requested funds to help cover a dental procedure that he had been putting off. Isaac already had $1,500 in savings, so he first requested $500 to help cover the $2,000 procedure. Without WSF, Isaac said he would have continued to delay the procedure and work more hours until he had enough funds to cover the cost. A few weeks after his initial request, Isaac had come back to WSF and requested the remaining $500 to cover funeral and travel expenses due to the death of a relative. Fortunately, the funds fully covered these costs, and when we spoke with him during his second interview, he felt extremely confident about his financial future. So this research has shown us the potential of emergency cash for low-income gig workers, especially in understanding how it can work, for whom it works best, and when it can be most impactful. Moving forward, as several others have noted, we're especially interested in investigating the full toolbox that low-income workers need to build financial security, exploring how emergency cash can fit within this toolbox, and how the composition of this toolbox may evolve depending on where workers are at in their financial journey. We also want to figure out a way to ensure the sustainability of emergency cash. And one prominent way we're thinking about doing this is by exploring the hybridization of emergency cash with savings. I'm now going to hand it back over to Tim, who will discuss the implications of these findings, especially in our current economic climate.
Thanks so much, Kiarash. I just wanted to try to offer some reflections about some of the broader lessons that we saw in the fantastic work that Kiarash just reported. And I'll just lift up two right now. The first is that we didn't just give people $1,000. We did give people $1,000, many people, but in the way that we did it, we also gave them a sense of control, a sense of agency. And I just think that's so important. You know, there are a lot of different ways that you can spend resources, but it turns out that trusting people, that is something that is just an enormous untapped opportunity. And the way that this program worked and the concept of emergency cash, it just baked into it a sense that you know what you need. And our job is simply to help give you the resources. And we're not going to question how you're going to spend the money, and we're not going to beat you up to prove it. We're just going to start from a position of confidence in you. And I don't mean to be misty-eyed. Sometimes we'll get that wrong, but I think we've far too long have underestimated what sort of benefits are possible when you start from that place. And as you just heard in the stories that Kiarash described, and you all know this, people are living some really, really tough situations. And that breath of fresh air, that psychological relief, that vote of confidence in you can make an enormous difference. And the second thing I want to lift up is that, you know, a byproduct of that was enormous goodwill. And we didn't go into this pilot thinking that that was something we wanted to generate, that somehow it would be great if, you know, if people would feel, I don't know what the word is, gratitude or something. But in fact, it's just remarkable. And people just feel, they're so surprised, right? That someone wants to be there for them in this acute moment of need. And the byproduct of that, I don't know what the limit of that is, but I do know that we're living in an age of historic lack of trust, historic low levels of trust in institutions. And if we have a mechanism, frankly, for fairly short money to rebuild trust and reassemble contracts between institutions and individuals, that seems really, really significant. I just don't see how we solve the problems we have around worker financial security, or probably worker power, without institutions playing a role. And so I wanted to share that as a key lesson from this work and something we might look for other ways to apply. Let me turn it back over to, I believe, Adrian to take us on. Thank you.
Tiffany. Hello, everyone. Me from the top of the agenda here. Thank you, Adrian and Tim, for setting that really crucial context, how we got here, why we did it, and for Kiarash for diving really deeply into what we learned. And Tim, thank you so much for that really amazing segue. Next, you all will be hearing from a series of other design sprint team members from this work, and they'll be sharing a lot more about the roles they played in the pilot and what they will be taking away. So first up, you'll hear from Adam Roseman, co-founder and CEO of Steady, and then I'll turn it over to Rachel Schneider, founder and CEO of Canary. Adam will speak predominantly to how do you get money to gig workers with the least amount of friction? And then Rachel will talk a little bit more about who should pay for emergency cash. With that, let's start with Adam. Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the role that you played in this pilot?
Sure. So first off, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Adrian. And the entire Workers Lab team for involving us in just this amazing project. Steady started out with a focus on how do we help people to increase their incomes, and the prospect of actually being able to help provide people with fillers when we're able to identify income gaps was just the most amazing thing that I could have anticipated. So it's been an absolute pleasure working on this project. I think in terms of defining our role in the design sprint, our business is built around, again, the concept of helping guide people on understanding how they earn and what they can do to earn better. With that, what we have across what is now roughly our 2 million members is a pretty good understanding based on information that we collect from them, and then also based on bank account data of their earnings trajectory, right? Who they're earning from, what industry they're earning from, and being able to identify drops in income. And what the Workers Lab was able to help us really think about is looking at those drops in income in particular and figuring out how can we step in together with the Workers Lab to provide fillers to those gaps that have been identified that may not be able to be filled immediately with replacement work, right, when they experience those gaps in income. So what we did in conjunction with the Workers Lab is to basically look across our member population, utilize our data set to identify individuals in specifically defined cohorts who had suffered from income loss, and also those individuals that were working in the gig landscape, just given that our worker population stretches across both gig and also non-gig work, things like hourly work, right, which is now being impacted, but during the course of the study was very much focused on the gig landscape. And then working with the Workers Lab to identify and figure out how do we specifically address and bring up the topic of providing funds during this very difficult time, because the messaging of that is so incredibly important. So thank you again to the Workers Lab. Thank you also to Rachel, who's coming up, for introducing us to this project.
Thanks, Adam, for that. One more question to you before we kick it over to Rachel. Tim sort of planted the seed about how important trust was. And so I wonder if you have any reflections on how trust reduces friction, right? Sort of what it means for folks to know Steady, to have a relationship with you. How does that actually help and support your ability to disperse emergency cash to them?
Oh, it's mission critical, right? I think we saw from the onset of this initial project to some of the more recent stuff that we've been doing with the Workers Lab that we're not talking about today, our ability to refine that messaging over time and build that confidence and trust in our members was so incredibly critical. Wasn't easy at first, right? Just given how vulnerable these individuals are and how much they need to question by nature. But over time, we've been able to refine that, and I think learn a tremendous amount, and it was very exciting to step through that process. I think just one additional comment that I'll make that we talked about yesterday in the Workers Lab is that as a result of this project as well, we were actually able to find a potential application for utilizing this verification of drop in income to potentially apply now to some state level UI offices from the standpoint of distribution of PUA funds, and specifically those individuals who are non-W2 workers. So again, had it not been for this study, we wouldn't be in a position now to be deploying that system in that fashion.
Thanks, Adam. And we will sort of bring you back at the end for a call to action for folks.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll move on to Rachel. Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about your role in the design sprint and sort of what drew you to this process?
Sure. So thank you, Tiffany, and thank you to the Workers Lab team for including me in this project. So I've been an advisor on the project from the beginning and was really drawn to it for a few reasons. The biggest one was that this was the rare opportunity to think about issues in a cross-sector way. And so I've spent most of my career thinking about financial security and financial services and behaviors like saving and borrowing, planning. And the Workers Lab team, of course, is anchored in worker rights as an idea and worker power. And so it was really valuable to bring people together who were thinking about really the same challenges, but through a very different lens. And I got a lot out of that process. The other reason I was so excited about it was the chance to think about ways that help workers that actually bring new money to them, right? Because when you think about saving and borrowing and planning, often, not always, but often you have to set aside the basic challenge that the people you're trying to help often simply don't earn enough money to cover the cost of their living. And in this project, we freed ourselves of that constraint. And we said, well, what should we do? What would we offer for workers if we could offer them something that didn't start out from a place of scarcity, but instead started out from a place of abundance? And Carmen often used that word in the beginning of this project of let's think from a place of abundance and imagine what workers could have if we didn't start out with the constraints of who will fund it and, oh, that's going to be really expensive. And that was really a joy. And of course, it dovetailed for me with a year that I spent in 2018, where I was supported by the Omidyar Network in looking at cash grants across society. So I was not only looking at cash grants through the lens of what we could do in the design sprint, I was also looking at how cash grants were being deployed by social service agencies, by colleges and universities, by municipalities, because increasingly people have been thinking about what is the role of simply offering people a cash grant when they need it. And so one of the things that I was able to bring into this project was some insights that a team that I was on with Commonwealth and the Aspen Institute and I generated around how employers will often engage in delivering emergency cash to their workers. And for me, even knowing that there is an existing practice where large employers in particular will set up a grant fund and make emergency funds available to workers, even knowing that that is a thing that exists in the world, I felt like gave us more of a grounding in the doability of something like the Workers' Strength Fund at scale, right? You can start to envision that there is a reason for multiple stakeholders to invest the dollars in creating emergency grant funds and in contributing to those grant funds over time. And so I've continued to spend a lot of my personal effort on that idea and how do we get employers to the table here to pay? And I think that's important because even as we think about this model for gig workers, we're still thinking about it through the lens of portable benefits. And you'd still want to think about, well, who is going to pay? And I know others on the call will talk about the role of government, and we're certainly seeing government step up to provide emergency cash right now. But I want to argue for the idea that employers can also be counted on to do their share and to contribute into funds like these for their workers. Because what we've seen, and this is not only in the last 2 months, but in general, but certainly very much over the last 2 months, is that high road employers want to be a source of support for their workers during times of hardship. And they will talk, part of the motivation to do that is the business objective, right? Knowing that it breeds longevity, knowing that it breeds better customer service, knowing that it leads to retention and job satisfaction that have a bottom line impact. But overwhelmingly, when you talk with workers, with employers about why they do this work or why they contribute, they say because it's the right thing to do. And the fact is they're not going to do it unless it's easy and cost effective and efficient for them to do it. And that's where philanthropic capital has been so critical, not only to do the case making work that this design sprint represents, and to do the field building work and communication work that this webinar and the research associated with it represent, but also to invest in building the infrastructure that then makes it easy for workplaces to deploy a solution like this. And so that's the work that Canary has been able to do. Canary is a new organization being incubated at the Workers Lab as a direct result of this design sprint. And what we are doing is trying to build the infrastructure that enables employers and platforms to offer emergency funds for low-wage workers in an ongoing way. Because I think we can all see that that infrastructure is desperately needed and needs to exist not only at moments of crisis. We don't need to stand it up only in moments of crisis. It should be there ready and waiting anticipating that workers, in fact, will have many moments of smaller crisis along the way as a normal part of an economic life. So I've just been incredibly grateful to be part of this project and to continue working so closely with the Workers Lab and others on taking this idea forward.
Thank you for that, Rachel. And thank you both, really, Adam, for really painting a picture of what it means to truly understand the worker that you're trying to reach with this emergency cash. And for Rachel, really doing this landscape analysis, right, of the various roles that folks can play to make this happen, particularly as we think about who should pay when we're not in an emergency time like we are now, right? And so there's a real role for employers here. And so thank you both for that. I'm going to transition and hand it off to my colleague, Betsy Edisari, who's actually going to tee us up to have a further conversation about the role that government and policy sort of can play in this conversation. So with that, Betsy.
Thanks, Tiff. And hello, everyone. My name is Betsy Edisari, and I'm the Managing Director at the Workers Lab. I think we can all agree that this COVID-19 moment has reminded us about the critical role the public sector and our government play in making sure that we have what we need to weather crises. And that's a great reminder. But how do we leverage what's happening now to make sure the infrastructure and safety net we need are built to last beyond this moment? What does emergency cash, where does emergency cash fit in this architecture? So with that, we're thrilled to introduce our two final partners who will share their reflections on the role policy and the public sector can play in strengthening the toolbox of supports workers need and deserve. So first up is Molly Cohen, Interim Director of the City of San Francisco's Office of Financial Empowerment. Hi, Molly. So Molly, why don't you share about the emergency cash pilot? Hi. You all have been designing and your role and relation to the Workers Strength Fund pilot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Betsy and Tiffany and the whole Workers Lab for putting on this fabulous event. So I'm Molly Cohen, as Betsy said. I'm the Interim Director of the San Francisco Office of Financial Empowerment. We do a variety of work around financial empowerment. We do universal college savings program, access to bank accounts, financial coaching. And it was really through our financial coaching that we came to this idea of doing an emergency cash transfer program. We were just learning about sort of the gaps that people had in their budget. We were learning from the research that Rachel Schneider done. And so we started looking for partners. We found an amazing partner in the San Francisco International Airport, which employed over 40,000 people. As I'm sure you can imagine, the impacts of COVID-19 have been severe for them. And then with the generous financial support of the Workers Lab and really the inspiration of the design sprint process and the Workers Strength Fund, we started to put together what this project could look like. We really view ourselves as sort of a public sector application of what the Workers Strength Fund is doing, and having this sort of support and thought leadership and partnership of the Workers Lab has just been really instrumental in helping us build enthusiasm and some credibility for this project within the city.
Thanks, Molly. And how has the COVID-19 crisis laid bare the limits and flexibility in our government's infrastructure to effectively deliver cash and emergency resources to workers?
Yeah, so this is like the question. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about the government and emergency cash transfers is that the government has done and continues to do emergency cash transfers. We oftentimes just don't call it that. And it tends to be sort of quiet. In San Francisco, we call this work barrier removal. In New York City, it's the emergency cash transfer is called one-shots for housing. People go to a window in housing court and essentially explain why they need money. And it's somewhat of a clunky and bureaucratic process. It feels pretty arbitrary to people. So COVID-19 has obviously blown this out of the water in terms of the need. And I know in San Francisco and the state of California, we're doing a variety of sort of emergency cash transfers, grocery cards, for people who can't afford food, cash transfers for undocumented families who aren't eligible for stimulus. We're thinking about how do we supplement UI. So I think the role for, OFE, the OFE, and other people who are working in this emergency cash transfer field is to really push the government and provide expertise to make that government is giving people money in a user-focused, responsive, less bureaucratic fashion. So the questions that we need to be asking are these programs well advertised and well run? Are they being designed to increase goodwill between government and people who are receiving the money? That for me was one of the main takeaways from the Workers' Strength Fund report, was the way that if you do this well, no strings attached, you can really build trust, which, as Tim said, is an all-time low with the government. And, something that's sort of near and dear to our heart is making sure that, if the government's giving people money, they're doing it in a way that builds really financial capacity. They're not just giving someone a check that they're going to go, to a check casher and pay all these fees for. So I think, there's so much that the government can learn from the work that you guys have done in the design sprint. And I hope that everybody will help me support in front of, the folks who are doing cash transfers.
Thanks, Molly. So one of the report's findings was that for many fund recipients, emergency expenses were often predictable and recurring ones like rent and utility bills. How are you all thinking about what constitutes an emergency, COVID-19 induced or not? And how are you thinking about it in the context of the pilot that you're designing or in the city in general?
Yeah, so this is a huge question. And it's something that we've struggled with, and particularly in the government, there tends to be a very sort of by the book mentality of an emergency must fall into X, Y, or Z buckets. We're doing our best. We're running a pilot. We're trying to be really responsive and flexible. And so we want to take a similar perspective to the Workers' Strength Fund and your design sprint process and say, anything that somebody identifies as an emergency, whatever that means to them, counts. We're in the Bay Area. I know the Workers' Strength Fund was also in the Bay Area and New York City. We're in an astronomically high cost of living. And particularly when you're working with people, our target audience is people who work at the airport. An emergency doesn't necessarily mean car breakdown. It could just be that a plane is late and so you can't get on, you can't take BART home and you have to, hire a cab or an Uber or a Lyft. That is an emergency. The cost of living every month is an emergency. And so it has been really helpful for us to see you and other people sort of take such an expansive view of emergencies to allow us to sort of promote that message internally.
Molly, thank you so much for that. Last but certainly not least is David Weil, Dean of the Heller School of Social Policy and Management. Hi, David. It's really great to see you from about a foot away on my screen.
Great to see you, Bess.
David, you spent your career studying policy and were at the helm of the Wage and Hour Division in the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Labor. Can you share your role in the Workers' Strength Fund pilot and what drew you to join this team?
Sure. Thanks, Bets, and thanks to Tiffany and Adrian as well. So I've been an advisor to the Workers' Strength Fund design sprint from the beginning. It really resonated with me because of my own work in this area. I've studied how business restructuring over several decades has really changed the place of working people and really eroded conditions of work for many, many workers across different industries, has made work pay less, has exposed more and more workers to the risks of the labor market, and has really changed what has always been a problem for workers in labor markets, and that is they have a lot less bargaining leverage than the people who get the benefit from their efforts. When I worked in the Wage and Hour Division and headed that agency, I saw firsthand through our enforcement work really how exposed far too many low-wage workers were to the ups and downs of the economy, how poorly protected they were from the crises that can come up in life, and even a crisis that some people would regard as mild, a car breaking down, seeing how that can unwind the position of a worker and their household. So that when I left at the end of the Obama administration and came back to academia and was very interested in continuing to pursue this, when I was approached by the Workers Lab with this idea of addressing not just the low wage problem, but the volatility of income that far too many working people face, and doing it in this structure of an experiment, to not just think about the problem, but very quickly act and see how an emergency cash, access to emergency cash, could affect that. I thought the idea itself was powerful, and I certainly thought the idea of experimenting and seeing what we learned from that, something I wanted to be involved in.
Thanks, David. So Adrian and a number of others have alluded to the fact that we've been thinking a lot about emergency cash as one tool in the toolbox that is our social safety net since we started our design sprint. In your view, what are or should be the other tools in that box?
Yeah, you know, we've been thinking about that toolbox for a long time in social policy. If you go back to the turn of the last century, when manufacturing was on the rise, more and more workers were losing work, were losing their job because they were injured at work and they had nothing to fall back on. And in that era, the great innovation was the idea of worker compensation, to make sure a working person who had been injured had an ability to still have earnings so that they could weather that storm. That was an incredible innovation of its day. Then came the Great Depression, and millions of people suddenly unemployed in a situation very similar to what we find ourselves in there. Unemployment insurance was added to the toolbox to understand the fact that the volatility of employment, the entire economy bottoming out, created a need for people to have earnings to sustain them through those kinds of crises. You know, later in the decade, we added other types of tools around discrimination and protections against harassment at work, occupational safety and health. So we have built up the toolbox. Unfortunately, we have sometimes taken tools out of the ability to make sure those things happen. And then more recently, finally, this country, and it has come out of this crisis, we have had a federal policy under the FFCRA and the CARES Act to provide at least some benefit, first of all, to provide paid sick leave and paid leave, and the CARES Act to provide a broader coverage of our unemployment insurance system. All of those are incredibly important pieces of this larger toolbox. The idea of adding something to deal with the volatility of income, the fact that it's not just low wages, but it's where you have a household with multiple incomes, you need protections when something goes awry in that area. I think it's a powerful addition to a set of tools that I think, going back to Kirash's presentation, it's not just one challenge that many working people face. It's really the intersection of all these things. And as we think about policies, I think we want to both think about the addition of this incredible new idea and tool, but also understand we also need the other tools in that set of boxes provided by our public policies.
Thanks, David. And thank you so much, Molly and David. Always very inspiring, always enlightening to hear you speak. And with that, I'll hand this back to Tiffany to bring us home.
Great. Thanks, Bets. And thank you, everyone, for those really amazing sort of reflections and thoughtful sorts of recollections of what we've all been grappling with over the last several years. We are sort of at time, so we're going to have to wrap from here. But before I do that, I'm going to just kick it to David, who is really leaving us with this nugget of sort of how do we think about emergency cash? Where do we go from here from the highest level possible? And so, David, could you close us out with a note here? So how can we be thinking about sort of emergency cash, right? You're giving us a little bit of this, right? But can you take us home with this about what, if folks were to leave here and do something tomorrow or in 6 months or in a year when things really start to subside, how can they sort of revisit or continue to keep this conversation top of mind to ensure that emergency cash makes its way into the sort of broader toolbox for workers.
Sure. I mean, I think what we are all living through, and we're far from done with this, has given everyone a sense of the vulnerabilities that millions and millions of working people have been facing for a very long time. And when we get a vaccination and when this pandemic becomes something that is in our collective rearview mirror, the fundamental issues that we have all been talking about are still going to be with us. I think the hope is there have been a lot of innovations going on in lots of states, both in our public policies and as we've heard today, in our private policies. I think we want to make sure we keep the momentum that has been stirred by this crisis to address these deeper problems and make sure that we learn from the experience of emergency cash and its importance in dealing with fundamental issues, and make sure we push to integrate those in our public policy responses as well as our private policy responses to make sure that the lives of working people can really be elevated.
Thank you so much, David, for ending us on that note. And thank you everyone for joining us. A reminder, please do access the report. We're so excited about it. And we hope you stay tuned to what the Workers Lab and Commonwealth will be up to in the coming weeks, because we will be having more conversations. And so thank you for joining us and giving us a little bit of time on your Thursday. And we are so grateful to have you and look forward to continuing the engagement around this.